Well, kind of as we work in review, and I like to go back over because I understand, I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I can't even remember what I had for dinner last night, let alone, what was talked about the Sunday before. And so kind of in the quick overview, and particularly if you've missed some of these along the way, we started all the way back in Daniel chapter 1 with Judah coming under attack by Babylon. And we said that Assyria, the great empire, had been taken down, and now there was a power vacuum in that area. And Egypt and Babylon were struggling back and forth for who was going to control that area that we know as the Middle East. Well, we said that ultimately Babylon, under a great king named Nebuchadnezzar, ends up filling that power void, and he takes down the nation of Judah. We had said that Israel had already been taken into captivity hundreds of years before, those 10 tribes kind of disappearing from history. But the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, collectively known together as Judah, are taken captive and carried away to Babylon. And as was the custom during this time when a nation was conquered, oftentimes the rulers would come in and take some of the nobles, some of the greatest of the men, and they actually often acted as hostages in some cases, particularly in Rome. They like to take some of the children of the royalty, and they would take them back to Rome, and they would get a good Roman education. And also, the message went back to the parents that if you rebel against us, you'll never see them again. Okay, and so this was very common. And so Daniel, who we said was of noble birth, he was an aristocrat in that society, a young man, a godly young man, and several of his friends are taken back to Babylon. We said that they were enrolled in a 3-year learning program where they were going to study all about Babylonian customs, Babylonian religion. But we said that during that time, as much as Daniel and his friends are kind of, for lack of a better term, being brainwashed by the Babylonians, fed all of this Babylonian religion and culture, that they never forget the God that they serve. And they decide to take a stand. And we said that the stand they took is Daniel and his friends determined that they would not be defiled by the food that the king served. And again, as we have mentioned before, we are not told what that defilement was. Maybe it was against their dietary laws. Perhaps it was food that was offered to an idol. But for whatever reason, Daniel and his friends realized that it would be wrong for them to eat it. And we said that they took a stand. And in our second message, we mentioned, but they didn't do it in an arrogant way. Okay, they didn't take the king's food and go throw it in his face and say, "We're not eating this garbage." Okay, and in a very respectful way, they took their stand and yet said, as they dealt with the eunuch, they said, "Look, you know what? We cannot eat this food. Look, put us to the test. Give us vegetables for 10 days and come back and see if we meet the standards that you're looking for." And sure enough, the eunuch agrees, and Daniel and his friends are blessed. And in turn, for the stand that they took, God blesses them. And again, looking back, it's easy to look at this and go, "Oh yeah, that's great. Take a stand and things work out great." We know it worked out great for them. They did not know that at the time. Okay, taking a stand is never easy. And you think about Daniel and his friends. That could have been the end of the story. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel could have been a very short book in our Bibles because the end of chapter 1 could have been, "And Nebuchadnezzar said, 'How dare you defy me?' and executed them." And there you go. And Daniel would be the shortest book in our Bible. But that's not how it worked out. And God ended up blessing them for the stand that they took and gave them great wisdom and ability. Well, in chapter 2, we talked about that Nebuchadnezzar, that king, has a vision. And we talked about the statue made of all the different materials, the head of gold and the chest of silver and the abdomen and thighs of bronze. And of course, I know every one of you are sitting there going, you could give me a quiz right now and I could tell you what each one of those represents. And I have absolute confidence that you could. But time being it is, we'll save you from that quiz this week. But in review, that head of gold represented Babylon, and God reveals that Babylon was going to be a great empire, but it would not last forever, and it would be replaced by another empire of silver, and that would be the Persians, who in turn would be conquered by the Greeks. And we know in history that would be under Alexander the Great. And as much as the Greeks conquered and as great as Alexander spread his empire, it did not last very long at all before the Romans came in and the legs of iron would replace. Finally, looking forward in history, as great as the Roman Empire was, it would not last forever either and would eventually crumble. And we look at that region of the world and see the nations that we believe one day will join together again in an alliance. But we're told in that vision that as we look look at the grand scope of history, it ends with a rock in that vision that came and smashed that statue into nothing. And we talked about that represented the Messiah's kingdom when Jesus Christ comes back and establishes his rule. Well, that was chapter 2. And into chapter 3, we're like, well, things definitely are going good now. They've taken a stand. They almost get killed because nobody could interpret the vision, but Daniel interpreted it. Life is good. No. And for whatever reason, maybe it was partly inspired by the dream, Nebuchadnezzar has this idea that he's going to build an image and tell everybody that they need to bow down to it. And so chapter 3 focused on Daniel's friends. We said that Daniel was absent in that chapter, but his friends are there. And Nebuchadnezzar says, look, all of you need to bow down to this image, and if you don't, I'll burn you alive. And so Daniel and his friends do not bow down to the statue, and they're brought before Nebuchadnezzar. And we talked about how Nebuchadnezzar looks at them, and interestingly was the question, if you remember, he asked him, he's like, yeah, and who is this God that can save you out of my hand? You know, that was an interesting question, and that's going to come up again today, as a matter of fact, as we look at today's story. Of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give one of the greatest answers, that yes, you know what? Actually, God could save us. But even if he doesn't, we are not bowing down to your statue. You almost see kind of a theme going on here, that if you look at the book of Daniel, one of the themes that I hope you pick up that keeps coming back is that we see that godly people are put in a position that they are forced to take a stand. And we see God's deliverance and God's blessing every time they do. And so Daniel and his friends take a stand. Nebuchadnezzar throws them into the fiery furnace, and sure enough, God does deliver them. And again, if you weren't here, you missed an amazing Johnny Cash song talking about that. I encourage you to look that up, Fourth Man in the Fire. Well, going on from there then, Nebuchadnezzar now is the focus. And we talked about, you would think, we've looked at Nebuchadnezzar, and he seems to be the villain of the book. But again, we talked a couple weeks ago that, God loves everyone, okay? And the people that we often write off, oh, that person would never come to know Jesus Christ. Often God works in their lives. I had this discussion this week, as a matter of fact, because I heard the leader of North Korea, I think he has COVID. His health hasn't been doing real well over the past couple days. And I'll be honest, in my heart, my first thought was like, good. All right, you know what? Rid the world of one more evil dictator that we don't need. No sooner was the thought here than God's like, yeah, but I love him too. And I was really convicted, why am I not praying for him? What would happen if that man were to accept Christ as Savior? Man, what kind of radical change would happen in North Korea if someone's heart in his position, an absolute dictator, was changed? Why am I not praying that God would take this and reach out to him? And I was kind of convicted because when you look at Nebuchadnezzar, okay, we've kind of glossed over. Nebuchadnezzar could be absolutely brutal. Think about it. We know the story is like he threw Shadrach, Meshach in the fire and they walked out. Okay, that was not his intention. Okay, his intention was for them to be burned alive. And yet God's going to reach out to this man as well. And in chapter 4, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar has a vision of a tree and it gets chopped down. And Daniel explains to him, he says, hey, that's you and your kingdom, and you're about to be humbled. You need to get right with God. Well, again, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't ready to listen to that. And we said that one day Nebuchadnezzar walks out on his palace balcony, looks over and says, man, check out this kingdom. I'm hot stuff, man. Look what I have built. And as soon as he says it, he hears the voice of God in judgment, and he ends up going insane for several years, living out in the fields, eating grass like a beast. Well, we are told that in chapter 4, one day, his reasoning comes back, and he looks up, and he realizes who the true King of Kings is. And Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that it's God who rules the affairs of man. Well, that brought us to chapter 5, and Nebuchadnezzar got things right, but apparently his offspring did not do so well. And as we look down the list of kings, we came to Belshazzar, and we talked about this king who was arrogant, so arrogant that one night he decided it'd be a great idea, let's throw a drinking party, and not only that, let's take it one step further. Let's grab those holy vessels that we took from the Jerusalem temple and bring them in. And we mentioned that it would be something similar to having a teen beer party here and then taking the communion stuff and using it for drinking games. And so God's judgment rains down. We said the hand wrote on the wall, and he tells this king that you have been weighed and you have been found wanting, and your empire is about to be turned over to the Persians. What that king did not know, and according to history, that while he was in there drinking it up, outside the city gates, the Persians were diverting the water that was running into the city, lowering the levels so that they could march right underneath the water gates and right into the city. And that very night, we're told, the city of Babylon fell to the Persians. That's a lot of story. And when we started this story, we believe Daniel was a young man, somewhere probably between 15, 20 years of age. When we come to chapter 6, he's not the young man anymore. He's at least his early 60s, may even be up into his late 70s. So we're talking about someone who has seen a lot, experienced a lot, but we're going to see that he still has not changed. And in chapter 6, it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would not suffer loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find ill against him concerning the law of his God." And what a testimony. You know, Daniel, that young man who stood by God in his early life, is the same Daniel in his late life who has that same reputation, someone who has excellence. And it's amazing because he really grabbed the attention of the Babylonian ruler, and particularly Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's going to be favored by the Persian rulers as well. And this Darius is probably one of the hardest things in Scripture that we deal with. Historically, I know you're like, okay, so tell me, who was Darius? And I'd love to tell you I had that answer. We don't, okay? We know that Cyrus is the name of the first king of Persia, and the name Darius does not appear until later in history, when we'll see Darius the Great as far as kings of Babylon. Bible scholars have kind of put forth a couple ideas. It is possible that this is another name for Cyrus that we have not found linked with him. It is possible that he took the throne name of Darius early on and then later went more by Cyrus the Great. It is possible that there were a few men, governors, who were in charge of that taking of Babylon, and then who were set up as rulers in the city of Babylon. This could be one of those as well, but we do not know. But I will tell you this, Daniel has a good track record so far, okay? This would not be the first time that historians have looked and went, yeah, that doesn't seem right. Only later we find something in the archaeology, go, oh, okay, now that makes sense. And so we are still waiting for those answers. And again, every day I get excited because, you know, anytime I see that archaeology news, I know some of you sometimes will come up to me and say, hey, did you see in Google about this archaeological thing? And I'm like, oh yeah, I got to go see it, because it's so exciting to see, you know, some of the answers to these questions. But the short answer is that we don't know for sure, but I would say that probably one of the predominant opinions is that very possibly this is Cyrus the Great, another name for him used in the book of Daniel. Well, Daniel is exalted to a position of power, and as the Persian Empire comes through, they were very, very organized. One of the things the Persians were, and again, they had one of the largest empires up to that point in time, and you know that when you have to run a lot of things, you need organization. Every school teacher knows that. It kills me every year. You know, you get, you know, a whole bunch of students in there. It's like, well, I gotta find a way to organize all of this. And the Persians come in and they set up these governors. And here, over these governors, there's going to be 3 men, kind of 3 special positions, running over all the governors, helping to administer the whole kingdom. Daniel is one of those men. Well, there's a real jealousy among the others. You know, this Judean, okay, this foreigner. How is this foreigner foreigner got into this great power. So they try to find something against him. And again, it says to Daniel's character, he lived a life that even his enemies had to acknowledge that, there's no corruption in this guy. We're not going to be able to bribe him. We're not going to be able to find him being dishonest. And they knew that the only way that they were going to be able to get him in trouble was to somehow involve the religion, his service of God. And it goes on and says, and so these governors and satraps thronged to the king and said to him, Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and the satraps, the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So a law is passed, and that it is forbidden to pray except for the king and towards the king, and prayer to Daniel's God has now been outlawed. And we read this, and I remember when I was younger, you think about this like, wow, I can't imagine. Can you imagine the government coming in saying that, you can't pray to God? Unfortunately, we look now, and you're probably sitting there thinking, that happens a lot nowadays, particularly in the public sector. We have a government that is antagonistic to religion and to prayer. And this is what Daniel is going to face. He's going to face this, look, you can't pray anymore, okay? Next 30 days, none of that. Look at Daniel's response. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. And I love that verse. Daniel knew. It's not like Daniel went back and he kind of accidentally, kept doing the right thing. It says, when Daniel knew. Okay? When he heard this, he goes back to his place, doesn't close the windows, make sure they're still open, and bows down and prays. It makes me think almost back to those younger years where his friends told Nebuchadnezzar, we will not bend, we will not bow. Okay? Same thing. Daniel's like, look, I'm still doing this. Okay? In the one case with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we see their refusal to worship a different God. In here, we see a refusal to stop worshiping the true God. And I love both sides of that. When we talk about taking a stand as Christians, sometimes we need to stand against things. We need to say, hey, you know what? This is against what the Bible teaches. We will not endorse this. Sometimes taking a stand is saying, this is something that God has commanded us to do, and we will not stop doing it. Well, again, no surprise that as Daniel does this, we come down and it says in verse 11, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. Now, this is a really different part of the story, because unlike Nebuchadnezzar, when we made a decree and when people didn't obey it, it's like, you know what, you're going to burn. Okay, we see that here, Darius realized he's been fooled into something that he really didn't want to get into, and he's made a very rash promise and mistake. Now, we're told over and over and over again in this that the law cannot be changed, that once it is written, it is written. We see that also in the book of Esther, where the same thing is is said about the decree to kill the Jews. And so the king, and again, he is absolute king, but for whatever reason, whether it's because he doesn't want to go against tradition, whether he's trying to solidify his power, for whatever reason, he acknowledges that, look, the law was made, I don't have the right to change it. And he says, continuing on, he was greatly displeased with himself, and he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of the lions. And so despite this king trying his best to kind of work around, is there a loophole? Is there something? There is nothing. And ultimately, Daniel is condemned to death with the lions. Now, being eaten by lions was not anything new. The Assyrians would lock up their people to be executed. They would lock them in cages with animals. We know, many of you are familiar with the Colosseum and the gladiators and the Romans. They often would take condemned prisoners to release them out to be eaten by lions. Christians, they would often take and they would wrap into the skins of animals and send them out to be devoured by wild animals. So this is a very common thing. And again, we know how the story ends. I think that's one of the hardest things of Scripture. I am so glad that I got to hear all these stories, but sometimes I miss hearing it for the first time. Because you look at this, and from Daniel's perspective, this is it. Okay? And think about, he's like, this guy has served God all his life. Okay? He's risen to the top. Often in life we think, okay, we start at the bottom and we work our way to the top. With Daniel, it feels like his entire life has been to the top, to the bottom, to the top, to the bottom. And here, down again, he is looking at facing death by being devoured by a wild beast. Notice what the king says. We said Nebuchadnezzar, when he brings Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he's like, what kind of God's going to save you from this? And this king has a little bit of a different attitude. And notice what the king says. It says, but the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Yeah, we're not told that Daniel's confident that he's walking out of this, but we are told the king is. And that's an interesting change. And you wonder, what kind of influence was Daniel having in the position that he was in, that this king would be so confident that God was going to deliver him? Well, as it continues on, it says, Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Well, the story continues. It says, Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. So this king is worried. He's confident, but not that confident, okay? And he's worried. He has a sleepless night. And yet you see the hope, because early in the morning, he's going to rise from his palace. It says in verse 18, Now the king went to his palace and spent the night. Oh, sorry, I skipped to the wrong place. Coming down, it says, Then the king arose early in the morning, in verse 19, and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? I wonder, was he really expecting somebody to call back? You can imagine him outside. We know he doesn't. Calling down there like, Daniel, you there? Did he do it? Did he save you? And in verse 21, probably the sweetest words this king ever heard. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. And Daniel really took a stand. And as he stands on that den, he says, you know what? God did deliver me. He's like, I have not done any wrong, and God has brought me through. I'll tell you, I think one of the encouragements out of this is, I know that not everything always works out great, but I will say this: when we take a stand for God, God works good through that. Even in the cases where, and we'll read, and study history, you'll know that in ancient Rome, there were many who took a stand who ended up getting devoured by lions, whose life were not preserved. And yet, their death and their testimony affected thousands. As people would watch, they would come to the arena to watch the spectacle of somebody getting torn apart by wild beasts, only to leave realizing, wait a second, man, that person was really resolute. They didn't back down in the face of death. And it will be that testimony that God will use to spread the gospel throughout the known world of the time. Well, Daniel in this case was spared. And he says, now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. One commentator I read brought out an interesting point with this, is, because the question is, wait a second, well, why are they bringing him out? I thought he was condemned to death. Wouldn't they just leave him in there and, with a stone on there until he died? But in the ancient world, and even in the not so ancient world, even during the Middle Ages, there was something known as trial by ordeal. And oftentimes, to find out if you were guilty, they would put your life in some kind of danger where it seemed like you would absolutely have to die. And if you lived, they took that as a sign from the gods that, oh, actually, you were innocent. And so, in Daniel's life being spared by God, this king, even in his pagan mind, realizes that this is a sign from God that Daniel is innocent. And so he is taken up. And it says, and the king gave command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Not only them, their children, their wives. And in case you think, well, the only reason, Daniel lived was, those lions were on their last legs and were dying down there and couldn't get up to eat them, we're told that as these men and their families were thrown in, it says the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Okay? For those of you who are movie buffs who have seen the movie Jurassic Park, there's a scene where they lower a cow into a pit of dinosaurs, and as that thing goes down, man, those dinosaurs don't wait for it to even hit the ground. I mean, they're all over. This is the image that as these bodies are being thrown in, Daniel just walked out of there having spent all night, okay? And now, as soon as these others are thrown in, these lions eat them. We see God's deliverance. Well, we come to the end of the book, and another theme that seems to keep coming through. One of the themes we see in the book of Daniel is we look at people who take a stand and what God does for them. We've seen kind of in the book of Daniel, we've seen this theme of humility. Those who are humble, God will exalt. Those who are proud, God will bring down. But the last thing, and the thing I want to leave with you today, it says, then King Darius wrote, to all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Why? For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. As I end this morning, one of the other themes of Daniel that keeps coming back again is there is one King of Kings. There is one God who rules over all. And that's the one thing that, again, I think as a church, we are increasingly going to have to take a stand. We see a culture that is becoming more and more antagonistic to religion and to the gospel. Once upon a time, there was a time in our country where if you said, I'm a Christian, people, even if they weren't a Christian, well, that's good, it's good that you follow your religion. Today, we're living in a culture that increasingly views Christianity as a negative, as something that is bad. And we increasingly are going to have to take a stand. But I think what Daniel reminds us is that we are on the winning side. And whatever the personal cost to us, we know that the kingdom of God will continue, that there is one King of Kings, his kingdom is coming, and his Son is coming to rule again on this earth, and we look forward to that.